Now we'll go ahead and discuss when and how to raise capital or raise funding either within your company so that you can work on this product idea or as your startup. And within this, we'll go through some of the terminology that can be intimidating in the world of raising capital so that you can sound facile and really understand what stage a company is at, even if you're looking to join them. This is a very important slide. As I mentioned in my earlier lectures, when we talked about assessing the problem and finding the customer, there were certain key points. And I would argue that this slide is the main point and the third key point in how to start a healthcare venture. As you can see on the left, market validation should precede fundraising. But let me take that a step further. On the graph, on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is value. And value can be in terms of money that someone is paying you for the product. Value can be in terms of outcome, such as lives saved. Value can be in terms of convenience, such as the ease of obtaining information on your phone. But what's really evident as you look at the bottom three boxes is that we've discussed within these lectures regulatory risk, technology risk, and certainly execution and management risk. But what we really want to highlight and what is counterintuitive is the first thing to do, particularly in healthcare, is to assess the market risk and move it to the forefront. And what that means, and at this point, this will be making a lot of sense to you, is that if you spend years, develop the technology, work on the coding, iterate the software, and come up with the world's best feature functionality for your app, but you haven't really identified who will be using it and how willing they will be to adopt it and how easily it will be to get paid for your product, then you have wasted your time. And that's a very difficult lesson learned by a lot of wonderful technology companies far too late in the game. When we launch, we'll go ahead and think about who our market is. We don't need to worry about that right now. So be very mindful, which we teach in classes, that this should come to the forefront. Now, why do startups fail? And I want you all to think about that for a while. There's many reasons why startups fail. Let's outline the top 20, and let's bear in mind that really only the first 3 are the ones that matter the most. And in an analysis, and there are many such graphs, you see that no market need, i.e., you have the world's best technology, your widget does something amazing, but no one sees the value, it really doesn't solve their hair on fire problem, is number 1. But number 2 and 3 are also interesting. Number 2 is you ran out of cash. You might have started with seed funding or one investor and they gave you a certain amount of money. And it's expensive to even develop and iterate software and do pilots. And if you run out of money, the whole process comes to a crashing halt. So the business side of doing medical software design becomes very important. And third, I really like number 3, not the right team. Not the right team for what you may need to do. Because if you have the right team, everything from 3 downwards on this slide, someone on the team or everyone on the team will think about and figure out together. As an example, let's jump to the last 2, burnout and failure to pivot. If the team members are burning out and the other colleagues on a small startup or within a division of a large company don't notice and say, hey, I got this. What can we do to help offload some of your work or help you think about it differently? If that doesn't happen and the team burns out, the process fails. And last but not least, the word failure. If you fail to see the feedback that no one really wants this particular product, but oh gosh, if you were just to change something or make a new functionality and throw away the 99 that you've already created within this digital tool, you actually have a gangbusters product. You have to be willing to throw away that 99% or at least put it aside for now. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what the terms mean. Let's start with seed venture. Early stage or pre-seed often comes from friends, families, colleagues. It's money that Essentially, you're telling them about your great idea and you're not even having to ask them. They're excited and interested, and they're giving you some funding. As far as you can take that funding, you run with it so that you have something to bring to angel investors, or now what are termed organized angels groups. Think of angels as people that really, as the name suggests, fly around looking for interesting ideas and just sort of drop money down. Now, increasingly, these groups are looking for a very organized, strategic business plan, much more than they ever did. But yet, again, they're willing to invest in you before you have a product, and that sort of means a lot. When you do get offered money from angel investors, ask yourself, does this person have experience in my sphere? Could they help my company grow? Because believe it or not, it's not just about raising money or capital, it's also about getting that strategic help. Now, as we talk about venture capital, let's talk about the series mentioned in the middle of this slide. I just want the audience here, I want you to really think about Series A. You're serious about ascribing value to your company. Investors want to know more about the strategy that you will take and not just your good idea, the path that you need. And after that, you may need a Series B. You may be done. But if you're going to grow and manufacture, you may continue to raise series. And then finally, at the bottom, I wanted to put some terminology because I want you to be facile in conversation. Really, that's all you need, is to show a demonstration that you've heard these terms and that you understand that you've got options. If you've developed software, everybody wants to be acquired or go public, be on the stock market, but honestly, some of the best deals come from licensing your technology to bigger companies. So for example, as a small company, you may make a catheter or a wonderful implant in the ear, and you may not have the sales force and the capacity to really grow that at scale, and you may want a huge company to buy you up, or you may want to license the technology to them. Absolutely reasonable. Second, I mentioned earlier that we often hear the term venture capital related to the earlier stages of funding, and private equity. Think of private equity as a way to raise money once you've already got something that's quite product driven, you have sales, but instead of being a public company, you need a large sum of money and a strategic partnership. Private equity firms often have the ability and the connections to help you with economies of scale. They can help you do things more efficiently, cheaper, and hopefully without losing quality. And if they really get into a strategic partnership with you, it can be a great way to grow your company globally. Now let's talk about how you present yourself when you have this business idea. First of all, you absolutely have to jump to the bottom of this slide. The best time to meet investors is when you're not raising money. That sounds so counterintuitive. The reason is people love to chat with you and get to know you when you're not asking them for something. Therefore, as soon as you have an idea and you know that you're comfortable sharing certain parts or the concept, go ahead and start talking to people. See what they think. Investors often say, oh goodness, if you came back to me with a widget that, swirls right-sided instead of left-sided or goes into the right ear instead of the left ear, I'd absolutely be willing to give you money. You can hear that, and when you come back to them, having made some pivot or edits, they're excited that you paid attention. But let's go through the actual nuts and bolts of building a business model. And what you can see in this slide is often very easy to find on the internet these days. There are so many examples of successful pitch decks, but I want you to avoid the key mistakes that many people make. Number one, when you're building the model, I wrote, avoid enormous total addressable market, something that you think is a big number with a B for billions, and then you feel folks will fund it. And we'll talk about why in a second. Second, you absolutely need both the 60-second elevator pitch. You're riding with an investor in an elevator, and you have to be able to convey your idea in 60 seconds or less. And if they follow up with a meeting, you can follow it up with a business deck. That being said, and we'll come back to this, investors often want to see that deck, but may not pay attention to much of what is in that deck. What do I mean? Well, you'll see on this slide, we're back to the market risk. What we want to understand and really hone in is, and investors are very facile with this concept, have you prioritized the market risk and looked if there's any potential competitors? How have they done? Has this idea come up before? Have you done your homework of other industries where this technology may or may not have worked? And finally, as noted on the left, will the customers value and change their behavior? So what do I mean by that? I seem to contradict myself a lot in these lectures. On the one hand, I'm telling you, craft the pitch, practice the pitch, have a deck. And on the other hand, I'm telling you, no one will really believe what's in your deck because how do you know? You haven't been in the market yet. What they're really asking is, have you done your due diligence? Have you at least thoughtfully sat down and said, what is the cost for me to hire one developer that can make X versions of this app with different feature functionality? Or what is the cost of all the components of my manufacturing this one widget? And if I had to manufacture 1,000, what would the per unit cost be? They just want to see that you've done a little homework. Most investors do not expect non-business people to suddenly understand all the aspects of the business, but they do expect that you'll do your homework in that, is there a market appetite for this? The next part, though, of raising capital is, I will say, the softer side. You've done your homework. You know your product. You've made a pitch. You are meeting with investors and talking to them even before your widget is complete. So they invite you back. The CEO or the head of your division in the company is meeting with the boss of the company. The person leading this product, the way I phrased it at the top, the CEO or the head needs to be knowledgeable on all aspects of the product. What will not fly is to say, oh, I'm just here to help you raise money, but I don't actually understand that part of how the app works. Let me get back to you on that. It would be a lot better if you had spent a lot of time really understanding how the product works and then really understanding who's going to use it, and gosh, even having a few phrases or quotes from the potential customers telling you the reason specifically that they like your product above all others. That being said, if you see the second bullet I wrote, admit when you don't know the answer. This is pretty similar to science, academics, engineering, or when we were in school. We don't like folks that say they know something and then pontificate about it when the person at the other end of the table clearly realizes they don't. Instead say, I don't have the answer to that, but I'll get back to you. Send a polite email with that information, and no one will ever fault you for that. And finally, I wrote, practice, practice, practice. The reason is when you're in the middle of a pitch presentation itself, you've finally gotten in front of the angel group or you're trying to raise a Series A, you get into the first slide and the investors completely ask you some distracting questions because they've looked at the deck and they're down to the 10th slide. How do you navigate and guide them back to the parts that you really want to get across? And this has very little to do with just an investor pitch or practicing your pitch, but a lot to do with mastering the art of conversation. So if we look back, I put at the bottom, you can go ahead and have appendix slides with additional models and data. And the good news is, if you're going through the pitch and they're asking for that additional data, models, other projects that you've been doing with the same software, it means that they're very interested, and that's a good sign. And they also know that you're not complete. So when you come to investors, what the next slide demonstrates is you had tried to retain the equity. What do we mean by that? It means you have done your best, either working in your company division or as the startup, to try to maximally build your minimum product before asking for money. But on the counter side of that, you also can show them, if I had the money, there's a lot further things that I could do with this product. Now, what I state here is again, the strategy around raising money. If there are 3, 4, 5 of you on this team going to raise money for investors, and you have decided that as the scientist of discovery or the engineer that really thought of it or the designer that came up with the idea, that you will keep 99% of the company for yourself, that's not really going to incentivize your co-founders to help you grow the product. So be fair, be equal. We always joke around in the startup world that it's much better to be able to take your idea and share your pie in a much more equitable fashion with others and grow and create or bake a much larger pie out in the real world. If your company is valued at several million or that $100 billion that we had earlier on one of our slides in the previous lecture, it's a lot better than saying, well, it's worth $1,000, but at least I kept it all to myself. And I say that jokingly, but it's definitely one of the key factors to the division amongst team members in an early stage startup. And it's really an open conversation that can be very uncomfortable for those of us that are scientifically minded or grew up in a very technical environment in terms of our education, because no one really talked about how do you make money with the things that you're creating. Now we come to bullet 3. How do we be creative in acquiring money without having to go to formal investors? Well, within the United States, there are some options that exist around the world with different names. So for example, we have SBIRs, or there's definitely grants from the federal government, state agencies, local hospitals, advocacy institutions that will give you money for forwarding your idea without taking a part of your company. Take advantage of that. And the second thing to take advantage of is perhaps there's even an accelerator or an incubator that you can join. And this is a very controversial topic. I list here some very successful healthcare examples within the US, both Techstars and Y Combinator. Why is it controversial? Because many people, especially investors, even feel that maybe the accelerator doesn't provide you that real world environment of having to sell your product. However, that being said, for those of us that were coding the software or making the widget or sitting in our big company at our desk really working on this project, it might be important to be in the company's incubator because you can network and meet other people that are in other disciplines that can help you really move the company forward. And finally, it's very important to note that nothing impresses investors with everything that I've said than saying we already have sales. We already have people that have paid us for our product. In fact, the next question is not how much did they pay you, but oh, how did you get them to do that? Or what were they paying you for? You can say, look, I made $50, as I showed earlier on one of the slides. But that is a lot better than saying I have 1,000 pilots in 1,000 hospitals around the world and none have paid me a single dollar, a yen, whatever the currency may be. So I argue at least, and some may differ with this, that minimally paid pilots are a lot better to start with and negotiate with than large-scale free ones, particularly in the healthcare space. We joke around that many startups can get piloted to death. Once the product is selling and you're meeting with investors, you go back to the conversation that we were having around Series A, Series B, and you start to think about what your product is worth and what price you can ascribe to selling it. And then that actually allows your company to have some value in the market very early on. The other thing to bear in mind is that one investor needs to commit. Once you have that first initial investor, you run around trying to very strategically and thoughtfully lock in some other investors. So it's that first investor that you really need to be interested in. If you can match that as someone who's also in your strategic space, that's a real win. For example, and I mentioned in our earlier lectures that I would return to this. So with PillPack, we talked about how the revenue models in healthcare can vary. It might be shocking to learn that for the first few years, PillPack, as with many other later successful healthcare companies, they were not sure what the revenue model would be. But they were sure that they needed to have some customers, they needed to be able to get the pills paid for by formulary, and that the users and customers on their site and using their product had to extremely love them. So think of it this way. Their goal was to provide the best customer experience over even the number of customers. And that was very strategic and a huge gamble, and it certainly worked for them, but it's unusual compared to other industries. Finally, I think we really need to leave this section with a few caveats. So, looking at this slide, enthusiasm is key. Is the team excited? Do they look like they love this product? Can you not get the team to just stop talking about how wonderful it is? I already mentioned, use mimicry, look up that concept for the conversation, but understand that if you look anxious, worried, nervous, whether your product will work, that is not going to impart confidence for investors. And the other big lesson, and this lesson may be more comfortable for folks that are scientists and technical people like myself, there will be rejection. Just like experiments fail, or patients may not get better with your treatment, you may get rejected over and over and over again. But if you iterate on the feedback of some of your key investors and you're able to do that and return with a better product, they might be very interested. So in summary, this was a racing through the world of raising capital. But as you can see, I think starting with learning some of the basic terminology so that when you walk in the room and they say, are you looking for seed funding or are you looking for Series A, you know how to answer that question. Second, you meet them in an elevator or you've had coffee with them when you just had an idea, you have that 60-second pitch down. Let's be honest, you may not have the business deck even done. If they say, come to my office next week, you excitedly go home and you look up sample decks and you put as much information as you thoughtfully can into a PowerPoint presentation. And as you build the model, they're well aware that if you haven't sold product yet, much of it will be wrong, but they just want to see that you took the time to speak in their language. And finally, if you as a team, whether you work in a company for a small, new, novel product division or a new drug, which is always interesting, or you're at a startup that is doing something very digiceutical or with a digital wrapper for a medical device, if you don't just keep talking about it as if it's the greatest thing in the world and you don't look excited when I ask you about it, I certainly will not be excited as your investor. So it is very important to understand that your love for the product often means that you'll stick with it when it gets hard. That's really the question that they're trying to answer.